Hey everybody. So in this talk, I want to start from the obvious, that AI is something that we make, and then move towards what might be to some a surprising conclusion, that consciousness is in fact substantially influenced by human values and interests. In other words, that consciousness is socially constructed. So first, some basic definitions. By consciousness, I mean phenomenal consciousness. So this is the capacity for subjective experience, what it's like to see red, to feel emotions, and maybe also pleasure and pain. As for social construction, this is easier by example. So I think of holidays, fashion, borders, laws, money, national identity. What's common across all of these examples is that sociocultural factors like human values or interests or practices play an important role in what these things are. So to say that like X is socially constructed usually involves three claims. The first is a metaphysical claim that sociocultural factors are in some important part like part of X's essence. Then there's an epistemological claim that if we want to explain X, we will need to at some point make some kind of reference to sociocultural factors. And then lastly, a practical claim, and probably most importantly, and this is a claim about how to live. So although X may seem to be natural, inevitable, or otherwise obvious, it could actually be otherwise. So we can, to some extent, change X. So fashions change, borders are disputed, laws are challenged in courts, and so on. So my general argument kind of like goes like this. First, there's good reason to think that AI consciousness is substantially influenced by human values and interests. Secondly, there's no difference between AI consciousness and consciousness in general. So consciousness means the same thing, whether we're talking about humans, animals, aliens, or artificial beings. And therefore, what applies to one applies to the other, and vice versa. So if AI consciousness is socially constructed, then so is consciousness in general. And hence the title of my talk, Consciousness in the Making. So I'm going to present three different lines of argument or evidence that collectively motivate this idea. And so you might initially think it's kind of crazy to think that consciousness might be socially constructed. So after all, it just seems like obvious that I'm conscious. It is the most immediate thing. It's pure, it's preconceptual. Having said that, appearances can be deceiving. Just because something appears to us as obvious or immediate or natural doesn't necessarily mean that it is so. So compare our views about morality or gender or sexuality with those of 50 years ago, or even those of like other people living alongside us today. And this isn't just like politics, but it's also about the subjects of proper scientific inquiry. So think about chemical elements, species, planets, and languages. So if you want to hear about this from the philosophy of science, talk to me. But as I said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So let's see how far we can go applying this approach to consciousness. Now, my first point is that phenomenal consciousness is not universal. So if consciousness is so immediate or obvious or central, then you would think that concepts of consciousness would be fairly consistent and also universal, but it's actually neither. First, looking at modern English alone, the word conscious is used to mean many different things, and many of these are actually completely unrelated to consciousness in the sense of subjectivity. So it could mean you're awake, it could mean that you're aware of something, I'm conscious of a fact. It could mean you could have self-consciousness or class consciousness. So notably, all of these things can occur in a p-zombie. So a p-zombie can be awake, can be aware, it can be self-conscious, could have class consciousness even. Now you might say that, okay, of course, natural language is obviously messy. What about in more rigorous fields of discipline? Now, phenomenal consciousness is a 30-year-old scholarly term of art. So Ned Block introduces this in his 1995 article. Before this, philosophers often regarded like awareness as an important part of consciousness, though today we focus more so on subjectivity. Now, according to the philosopher Kathy Wilkes, phenomenal consciousness is a historically recent and linguistically idiosyncratic concept. So in her research, she finds that the term conscious is, in its modern sense, is actually barely 3 centuries old, first appearing in English in 1620, and it's not until about a little over 50 years later that the noun consciousness first appears. So in this sense, it means something more like shared knowledge, coming from the Latin roots con, with, and scientia, knowledge. And Wilkes argues that the rise of consciousness and its increasing association with subjectivity is directly tied to the 17th century Cartesian redefinition of the mind as something as like a private inner stage. And additional findings that I'll just mention, there's this historical emergence is even later in French and German, and there's no cognates in ancient Greek or modern Chinese. So just because we didn't have a word for consciousness back then, or that the early uses of consciousness meant something different, doesn't mean people didn't have subjective experience. Of course, but that's missing the point. We're not denying that ancient Greeks or even the English has subjective experiences. To be sure, they spoke about emotions, pain, colors, and more, but it was not obvious to them to group all of these things under one heading, consciousness, as we do today. So either as an immediate or core element of their daily lives and ethical systems, or as a subject of scientific and philosophical inquiry. And this is a problem for consciousness insofar as we think of consciousness as a natural kind, as something that is out there in the world, independent of human values or interests, just waiting for the sciences to discover. And for this, I'll return to the present day. To see this, we can look at how people use and apply the concept of consciousness. And this approach mirrors how we study gender. For example, our gender attributions reflect our underlying concepts of gender. So somebody who doesn't respect pronouns, for example, might actually have a more biological essentialist concept of gender, whereas somebody who does might have a more social constructivist approach. And likewise, in the case of digital minds, maybe somebody exhibits chauvinistic attitudes towards a digital coworker, and maybe this evinces that actually they have a more substrate-dependent concept of consciousness. The key point here is that our consciousness attributions are driven not only by the facts and evidence, but also by other considerations. For one, economic incentives. So companion chatbot companies may support more inclusive concepts of consciousness insofar as they stand to profit from increased consciousness perceptions among their user base. Conversely, developers might might favor more demanding concepts of consciousness in order to skirt welfare regulations. And then turning to ethical values, which can also play a substantial role here. So take the precautionary principle that is employed in animal sentience. So to summarize, this is motivated by a risk asymmetry. So failing to recognize a conscious being as conscious involves more harm in expectation than incorrectly recognizing a non-conscious being as conscious. So the false negatives involve more harm than false positives. Thus, it is better to err on the side of caution. So what we see here is that our values actually favor a more inclusive concept of consciousness, and this is doing so independently of facts. And this is good. So this is the recognition that our scientific consequences, or our scientific concepts do have consequences, and these consequences are measured in welfare and suffering. As for my third argument, this draws an analogy between the shift in discussing artificial intelligence versus the shift in discussing AI capabilities. Actually, no, I leave this one as an exercise to the reader. So a quick wrap up. Lessons: look beyond the ivory tower. First, trust the experts. Secondly, but also don't for a second think that the experts are the only ones who have a say in this, or even the most influence. Public narratives will play a pivotal role in how the history of AI welfare will be written. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. You speak of false negatives being more impactful or potentially more harmful than false positives for identifying things with consciousness. But if consciousness is a social construction, I'm not entirely clear on how something possibly could be, a classification could be a false negative or a false positive. It seems to me that if consciousness is socially constructed, there is no fact of the matter outside of your classification as to which way something should be classified. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the role of consciousness in this entire like framework is to mediate between or is to precify the ground of moral status. So moral status has like a how we conceptualize moral status or what are the criteria for moral status directly links to welfare outcomes. So here we're using consciousness as a scientific criterion, essentially a proxy for moral status because we cannot like directly measure moral patienthood. So does that answer the question?
Yes.
Thank you.